Well, thanks, everyone. I did not expect to be making this video this week, but Respawn did me a favor by releasing something that shows they have learned absolutely nothing when it comes to continuity immediately after I complained about that very problem. Some background. Apex released a gorgeous new Stories from the Outland short recently, and they always release these to introduce new playable characters. The first minute of the short is spent solely dedicated to jerking off Titanfall fans, while simultaneously breaking continuity and making very little sense, because of course it does. The grunt at the very beginning of the short that gets lasered by an ion with no gun for some reason is pretty clearly a militia grunt. They've got the Frontier Militia colors and no IMC markings. A Titan comes down to defend the new character Conduit as a child, and in the narration she outright states that she was being saved by this Vanguard, which tracks with the narrative of both Titanfall games. The Frontier Militia are the good liberators, and the IMC are bad. This Titan opens fire on the IMC Titans, proving that it's militia, except it's a Monarch. The Monarch was the only Titan added to Titanfall 2 post-launch, and it was pretty obviously made with as few development resources as physically possible. The model is just a Vanguard class, and all of its abilities are taken from kits that are in the campaign, which were scrapped for multiplayer, with the exception of its shoulder-mounted laser thingy. It even reuses Ash's termination animation from the campaign for its default execution. Lore-wise, the IMC made the Monarch by reverse engineering the militia's own Vanguard-class Titans and then distributing her into the field. So, what is she doing here on the militia's side, 1v10ing a bunch of ions? Back when Monarch was released, they did include this disclaimer at the end of her description to justify why she would be on both sides of the fight. It does, however, pretty specifically state that the only ones who'd ever want to buy this are independent mercs. You know, like the ones the giant mega corporation would buy en masse with their untold wealth and resources. Sure, some mercs might not want to fight alongside the IMC due to personal and moral concerns, but at that point, you're not much of a merc, are you? An independent merc goes for whoever is paying the most, and if you instead join up with the militia regardless of pay because you don't agree with the IMC, that makes you a militia soldier. Now, that being said, surplus stuff does get used all the time in war. Just look at Ukraine over the last year. It's not literally impossible that the militia could wield a Monarch, even though it makes very little sense for them to when it's a bootleg version of their own Titan. But, as the creative director for this short, why would you not just pick something that makes logical sense instead? I don't know who made the decision for this to be a Monarch. It could have been a writer, an artist, hell, it could even be fucking Vince Sampella himself, and I would still find it a questionable decision. If you wanted the Titan to look like BT for fanservice, why not just have it be a Vanguard? That aside, all of the other Titans in this short are ions. I do mean literally all of them. I thought they might be Atlases at first instead of ions, but they use their laser core frequently and they all look identical, so they have to be ions. The ones that actually have guns look a lot like splitter rifles too, although they sure as hell look like they're firing bullets for some reason. If these ions were actually using their kits as depicted in-game, this Monarch would be fucked. There's like 7 of them. The amount of vortex shield uptime they'd have is basically eternal, so Of course, they never use it. The problem with deciding to make every single Titan in this short an Ion is that it was literally the worst possible Titan choice for this fight to make logical sense, and was most likely only chosen because big laser. Literally any other Titan would have been a better pick, because they don't have an immediate counter to Monarch's attacks in the form of the Vortex Shield, which is infuriating to watch them arbitrarily not use for no reason. This shot with a Monarch getting gunned down by 5 Titans at once would have been a lot better with 5 Legions, no? It'd also make their guns firing bullets actually make sense, because Ion's gun fires energy particles, not bullets. All of these complaints so far are largely nitpicks, problems which are incredibly easy to avoid, mind, but are largely inconsequential. All of that was in service of this moment. The Monarch crunchitizes a battery, and it causes an explosion of radiation atop this mountain. This shot is gorgeous. The way it transitions into the follow-up shot is very well done, but unfortunately, it makes absolutely no sense. Firstly, you can pretty clearly see that the Monarch does not jump very far to get to this hill, and the explosion is huge! These infantry, not to mention Conduit herself, should be super dead. After that, this Monarch just, stays there? With the broken battery in hand even, still seeping radiation some 20 years later. No one scrapped all of these mechs, ever. Really? Titans would be full of so much crap that scavengers would be dying to get their hands on. Titanfall 2 even mentions IMC salvage teams on its first mission, though I do concede that they might have gotten less active as time went on. Not only that, apparently in the Titanfall universe, where people are using uranium batteries en masse, they have no way of cleaning up nuclear waste. Why was the wreck of the MCS James McAllen traversable at all, if these are so unstable? They bothered putting up a fence to tell people to go away, but didn't even touch the battery! This leads me to assume that it must be dangerous enough to be lethal by just being near it, but that leads me into the absolute worst part of this short, which is Conduit. You have to remember, this short is intended to introduce a new character to Apex. She is barely present in her own short because they were too busy with Titanfall fanservice, to the point where they unironically forgot to address why the character that they're introducing is even relevant. She sees her sister come back hurt one day from something. It's never explained. She could have received this wound from anything, from getting beat up by gang members to tripping, and inexplicably decides 3 things. First, that she needs to do something, and the second is that she's joining the Apex games, and the third is that she's gonna walk up the mountain to the destroyed Monarch. She proceeds to do that, and then radiation powers. What? This sounds so unbelievably poorly written that it legitimately sounds like I'm intentionally leaving out things, but I swear to God that is actually how it's presented. Her sister does genuinely just show up with a wound out of nowhere, and this is the inciting moment of her hero's journey, and it's so flimsy that it's like deciding to become a Counter-Strike pro because your dad stubbed his toe. Who did this to her? What is engaging in a blood sport going to do to save her community? This is the most fundamental question I could ask, and it is unanswered entirely. Why does she have magic powers? What is happening? So, if no one cleaned up this radiation, I assume it must be insanely lethal, but she sure seems just fine. Why is she only doing this now? How does she even know this? The fix for this is pretty simple, and it's to make Conduit an actual character in her own short by structuring the fight differently. Start with Conduit hiding behind a destroyed Titan, finding her magic radiation powers when she touches the battery in its husk, and then somehow use that power to trigger the explosion that's in the animation already, either intentionally or on accident. No one knows it was her, she has to kind of hide out of shame for the rest of her life until something that the Syndicate does happens to her family, which forces her to utilize her power to save them. Boom. Done. As a bonus, this doesn't create a The Last Jedi plot hole where it's incredibly unclear why Titans didn't ever do this beforehand. I don't buy that this is a dramatized version of nuke eject, because you don't actually see the pilot eject, and it's likely they just wanted to focus on the dramatic aspect of the pilot sacrificing themselves as it lines up with the narration. Now, this animation aside, I did want to follow up on the previous video because I saw a lot of people bringing up good points and some ones that are backed up by almost nothing. The most common one that I've seen is people saying that Bangalore and or Jackson are pilots or had pilot training. They did not. Or so I thought. A few years ago, Respawn released a lore book called Pathfinder's Quest, and it contains, literally, the only piece of evidence for either of these two having pilot training. I bought this book when it released, but I opened it back up for this video. Here's a picture from my actual physical copy, pretty much confirming that Jackson was the first to get his Titan and pilot certification over Anita, implying that she did too. This is pretty undeniably a smoking gun for their skill, and so let me ask, why is this the only place that this information is? Knowing Bangalore and Jackson were literally trained pilots is pretty important information for justifying this fight, no? Something tells me that not even Respawn are aware of this little tidbit because Moy Para, an animator at Respawn who deserves a lot of love, who was heavily involved in the creation of content relating to this update that this animation shipped with, made a video talking about it. Not once in this video does Moy ever mention Bangalore nor Newcastle's pilot training, only that Anita is a sergeant and Jackson is a lieutenant. Hilariously, he also refers to pilots as super soldiers, contradicting the old Titanfall post that I mentioned last time, but that's totally understandable. A lot of the short is wasted on showing random crap in their lives before the war, which has already been shown off in other media, like that very book. Having the first half of the short be instead about Jackson and Anita's pilot training would have been way more relevant than them slamming brewskis. Showing their training on Gridiron would have made everything else make so much more sense, as well as immediately conveying to the viewer that it's not insanely one-sided. In the flashbacks against this militia pilot, she could have even been in pilot gear and still lose. This would feel a lot less like filleting Titanfall fans and more like actually justifying the second half of the story and showing how they've grown as pilots. A really important part of telling a story is justifying the actions that are taken in it, especially in something long-running like this. Sure, it's not at all completely impossible that a grunt could kill a pilot, just like how it's not completely impossible that a monarch could be a militia titan. But when you haven't really shown Anita nor Jackson's combat prowess, Bangalore is exclusively called an ex-IMC grunt in literally everything that she's in, to the point that not even the animators know she had pilot training, and then put them up against someone called a commander who looks like this, and I will 100% expect the pilot to win, and if he doesn't, it's a sign that you have not done a good job establishing or justifying what's happening. I shouldn't have to refer to a single line of a book released years ago to justify this short not ending at this scene. Stuff in the book discussing how Bangalore dealt with the end of Gridiron directly contradicts the animation, by the way, because continuity is hard. It also includes an extremely relevant plot device which is not at all mentioned in the animation or at all past the book itself, and it's heavily implied, at least by my reading, to be the time travel device in Effect and Cause. Do you see the problem here, with the story that they're telling being only justifiable by details in the one piece of media covering the same events, which it is heavily contradicting? What the hell is supposed to be canon? Is Bangalore a pilot or not? Is the plot device ever going to be relevant again? Does it even exist? Is the status of their lore bible akin to Swiss cheese? I can say with absolute certainty that Scryer's edginess and overconfidence was not well enough established. Even simple stuff like the smart pistol somehow missing can be easily explained away with a throwaway voice line of Scryer going like, "It doesn't lock onto IMC. God, I'm so cool." The problem here is not that there are no explanations. You can contrive an explanation for any asinine scenario that you want. Just because it's theoretically possible doesn't make it a good choice. When I complain about something like this and say that it's bad, it's not because I think there is no possible explanation for events like this. I think that it's poorly done because the edits required to make these scenarios make a lot more sense are very, very obvious to the point that even an idiot like me can recognize them. Stuff like the Militia Monarch or the Legion's Vions being kind of silly is such an incredibly obvious thing to point out at the earliest phase of production, and yet it got through anyway. Seriously though, why does Conduit have radiation powers? How's that not addressed? Thanks for all the support in the previous video. Seeing all the numbers continually climb is a little horrifying, but certainly rewarding. Press the algorithm buttons, and because this worked so well last time, let me ask again. Before watching this, did you have any idea about Bangalore's pilot training? Is it a good addition to her character or not? I'm interested to hear what people think, especially about the latter question because my mind on it is pretty set. Thanks to Emmy for their reckless financial abandon. Both them and the rest of my patrons are wonderful people. Like, comment, subscribe, you know the drill. And have a good night.